April 17, 1945. The morning sun broke through the pine forests of Bavaria as a convoy of American trucks wound its way toward a makeshift detention facility near the town of Dachau. Inside the compound, 347 German women auxiliaries sat in rows on wooden benches, their grey uniforms dusty and worn, their faces etched with exhaustion and uncertainty. They had been told by their commanders that capture by the Americans would mean torture, starvation, perhaps death. They believed the Allies were coming to exact revenge for years of conflict. They could not have been more wrong. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What happened over the next 6 weeks would shatter every assumption these women had been taught, transform their understanding of humanity itself, and create a moment of cultural collision so profound that its echoes would resonate through decades of post-war reconciliation. The instrument of this transformation would not be speeches or propaganda, but something far more powerful. The haunting melodies of spirituals sung by African-American soldiers who understood suffering in ways that transcended nationality and conflict. The women who sat in that compound represented a cross-section of wartime Germany's female auxiliary services. They were not combatants in the traditional sense, though they had served in crucial support roles throughout the German military apparatus. There was Margaret Hoffmann, 23 years old, who had worked as a radio operator in Munich coordinating supply logistics for German forces. Her hands, once steady on telegraph keys, now trembled as she clutched a thin blanket against the April chill. Beside her sat Frieda Weber, 31, a former schoolteacher from Dresden who had volunteered for auxiliary service after her husband was reported missing on the Eastern Front in 1943. Her eyes, once bright with ideological fervor, now held only emptiness and fear. In another section of the compound sat Elisabeth Kaufmann, a 27-year-old nurse who attended wounded soldiers in field hospitals from France to Poland. Her medical training had shown her the cost of the conflict in flesh and blood, but nothing had prepared her for this moment of reckoning. Near her was Anna Schmidt, barely 19, who had joined the auxiliary services straight from a youth organization in Hamburg. Believing she was serving a noble cause, her youth had been consumed by propaganda and duty, and now she faced an uncertain future with the terror of the truly indoctrinated suddenly confronted with a different reality. These women came from different backgrounds, different regions, different social classes, but they shared one commonality. They had been systematically taught that the enemy, particularly the Americans, were barbaric, uncivilized, and bent on destruction. They had been told specific and horrifying stories about what African-American soldiers would do to captured German women. The propaganda had been relentless, designed to inspire both fear and continued resistance. As they sat in that compound, watching American soldiers establish guard posts and organize the facility, every interaction was filtered through years of indoctrination. The American forces who took control of the detention facility in mid-April 1945 represented a different kind of cross-section. The 761st Tank Battalion, an all-African-American armored unit, had been assigned to secure the area and manage the temporary detention of auxiliary personnel, while higher command determined what to do with the thousands of non-combatant prisoners who were surrendering as Germany collapsed. The battalion had distinguished itself throughout the European campaign, fighting through France, Belgium, and into Germany itself, despite facing discrimination within their own military structure. Leading the detachment assigned to the women's facility was Captain James Morrison, a 34-year-old officer from Atlanta, Georgia. Morrison had been a music teacher before the conflict, leading church choirs and teaching young people the spiritual traditions that had sustained African-American communities through centuries of hardship. He was a tall man with gentle eyes and hands scarred from tank operations, and he carried himself with a quiet dignity that commanded respect. Under his command were men who represented the full spectrum of African-American experience in wartime. Sergeants from Chicago and Detroit, who had worked in factories before enlisting, farm boys from Mississippi and Alabama, who saw military service as an escape from sharecropping, educated men from Washington and Philadelphia, who faced the irony of fighting for freedom abroad while their families faced discrimination at home. Staff Sergeant Robert Wilson, 28, from Birmingham, Alabama, had been a coal miner before the conflict. His voice was a rich baritone that had led hymns in his Baptist church every Sunday since childhood. Corporal Marcus Thompson, 22, from New Orleans, had sung in jazz clubs on Bourbon Street before enlisting, his smooth tenor capable of sliding between sacred and secular with equal facility. Private First Class Thomas Jefferson, a name he bore with both pride and irony, was 20 years old and had left Howard University to join the fight, bringing with him an understanding of the spiritual tradition as both musical form and historical document of resilience. These men had fought their way across Europe with distinction. They had faced enemy fire, harsh weather, mechanical failures, and the additional burden of proving themselves in a segregated military that often questioned their capabilities. They had liberated towns in France where grateful citizens had welcomed them as heroes, only to return to camps where they faced segregation from white American units. They carried this contradiction with them, along with their tanks, their rifles, and the songs that had sustained their communities through far longer and deeper struggles than this conflict. The initial encounters between the guards and the detained women were tense and silent. The women had been processed, given basic medical examinations by American medical personnel, and assigned to barracks that, while austere, were considerably better than what many had experienced in the final chaotic weeks of the German collapse. They received regular meals, rations that included bread, canned vegetables, powdered milk, and occasionally meat, portions that seemed almost generous compared to the deprivation that had characterized the last months of the conflict. Yet despite this treatment, which contradicted everything they had been told to expect, the women remained withdrawn, suspicious and afraid. Margaret Hoffman would later write in her diary, which she somehow managed to keep throughout her detention, that the first few days felt like waiting for inevitable violence that never came. She wrote, "The American soldiers are polite but distant. They bring us food 3 times each day. The portions are adequate. They do not shout or threaten. This makes me more afraid, not less. I keep waiting for the cruelty we were promised would come. The not knowing is worse than any punishment could be." Captain Morrison observed this tension with concern. He understood that these women posed no threat, that they were essentially civilians who had been caught up in a massive military collapse, and that their fear was genuine, even if it was based on false propaganda. He also understood something deeper, that the transition from conflict to peace required more than just the absence of violence. It required connection, understanding, and the breaking down of dehumanizing narratives that had sustained years of enmity. On the evening of April 21, Morrison called together his senior non-commissioned officers in the small building that served as their headquarters. The spring evening was cool, and through the window they could see the women in the compound moving listlessly between barracks, their faces shadowed with anxiety. Morrison spoke quietly to his men. "We've got a situation here that's about more than just guard duty," he said, his Georgia accent soft, but his words carefully chosen. "These women are terrified, not because of anything we've done, but because of everything they've been told we would do. They're waiting for monsters. And every day we don't become monsters. They get more confused and more afraid." Sergeant Wilson nodded slowly. "Been seeing that myself, Captain. Had one of them flinch when I walked past yesterday, like she expected me to strike her. Just doing my rounds." "The question is," Morrison continued, "how do we show them they're safe? How do we demonstrate that we're not what they've been taught to fear? Orders say we keep them detained, fed and secure until transport can be arranged to proper processing facilities. But that could be weeks, and I'm thinking we have an opportunity here for something more than just warehousing prisoners." Corporal Thompson leaned forward. "What did you have in mind, sir?" Morrison was quiet for a moment, looking out at the compound. "Back home, when there's been conflict or hurt in the community, when people are carrying burdens too heavy to speak, what do? Private Jefferson understood immediately. We sing." "That's right," Morrison said. "We sing, not to entertain, not to perform, but to witness, to testify, to share the part of ourselves that understands suffering and survival." He turned to face his men directly. These women need to understand that we're human beings. Not monsters, not avengers, just men who have known hardship ourselves. And I can't think of a better way to communicate that than through the spirituals. Songs that come from a people who survived the unsurvivable, who maintained humanity in the face of systematic dehumanization. Wilson's expression was thoughtful. You think they'll understand? They don't speak English, most of them. Music doesn't need translation, Morrison replied. Pain understands pain. Survival recognizes survival. The spirituals aren't just songs. They're documents. They're proof that people can endure and maintain their souls intact. If these women can hear that, really hear it, maybe it'll start breaking down some of the walls. The decision was made. The following evening, after the women had received their evening meal, the American soldiers would gather in the compound's central area and sing. No announcement, no explanation, no forced audience, just men singing the songs of their heritage, and whatever happened, happened. Word spread through the American detachment with remarkable speed. Men who had grown up in church choirs, who had learned spirituals at their grandmother's knees, who carried these songs as part of their identity, began to organize. They would perform a cappella, the way the songs had been sung for generations. No instruments, no accompaniment, just voices blending in harmonies that had been refined through centuries of communal singing. April 22 was a clear evening. The sun set over the Bavarian hills in brilliant oranges and purples, the kind of sunset that seemed too beautiful for a world still processing the immense destruction of the past 6 years. As darkness gathered, lights came on in the compound, harsh electric bulbs that cast stark shadows. The women finished their evening meal and began moving toward their barracks for the night, the routine that had already become familiar in the handful of days since their detention began. Then something unexpected happened. In the center of the compound, near the flagpole where an American flag hung limp in the still air, about 40 American soldiers began to gather. They formed a loose semicircle, men of varying heights and builds, their uniforms clean, but showing the wear of extended service. They didn't call attention to themselves, didn't summon an audience. They simply stood together as the evening settled around them. Captain Morrison stood at the center. He closed his eyes for a moment, thinking of the church in Atlanta where he had led choirs, of his grandmother who had taught him these songs, of the long history of pain and perseverance that these spirituals represented. Then he raised his hand slightly, a conductor's gesture, subtle and sure, and began to sing. His voice started alone, rich and deep, carrying across the compound with unexpected power. The first spiritual was Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, one of the most well-known, but sung with an intensity and authenticity that transformed it from a familiar tune into something profound. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home, Morrison sang. And the weight of those words, the longing for deliverance, for home, for an end to suffering resonated in every syllable. The other voices joined in, creating harmonies that seemed to rise from some deep communal well. Sergeant Wilson's baritone provided a strong foundation, while Corporal Thompson's tenor soared above, and Private Jefferson's voice wove between them with fluid precision. The harmonies were complex but felt effortless, the product of a musical tradition that prioritized blend and communal expression over individual display. The effect was immediate and startling. Women who had been walking toward their barracks stopped in their tracks. Margaret Hoffman, halfway up the steps to her assigned building, froze with one hand on the railing. The sound that filled the compound was unlike anything these women had heard before. It wasn't martial music or patriotic songs. It wasn't the harsh anthems of ideology. It was something else entirely. Music that carried within it both sorrow and hope, pain and transcendence, the acknowledgement of suffering and the insistence on survival. Elizabeth Kaufman, the nurse, turned slowly toward the sound. She had heard many things in her years of service: the screams of wounded men, the harsh commands of military efficiency, the dull roar of artillery in the distance. But this music pierced through all of that accumulated noise and reached something deeper. Tears began to form in her eyes before she even understood why. Anna Schmidt, the youngest of the detainees, felt her carefully constructed worldview begin to crack. She had been taught that these men were inferior, uncivilized, dangerous. Yet the sound coming from their assembled voices, spoke of a civilization far older and perhaps deeper than anything she had been taught. There was sophistication in those harmonies, emotional complexity in the phrasing, and something that could only be described as profound humanity. The song finished, the final notes hanging in the air as the harmonies resolved. For a long moment, there was complete silence in the compound. The approximately 340 women who were outside had all stopped moving. Guards at the perimeter stood still. Even the wind seemed to pause. Then Morrison began the next spiritual. "Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child" was a song of deep sorrow, a meditation on separation, loneliness, and longing. The soldiers sang it with voices that knew separation intimately, men who had left families behind, who served in a military that segregated them from their white countrymen, who fought for a country that denied them full citizenship. "Sometimes I feel like a motherless child, a long way from home," they sang, and the repetition of "a long way from home" became almost unbearable in its emotional weight. Frieda Weber, the schoolteacher from Dresden, sank down onto a bench near her barracks, unable to stand. She had not cried since learning of her husband's disappearance 2 years earlier, had armored herself against grief with ideology and duty, but this music bypassed all her defenses. The raw emotion in those voices, the acknowledgement of pain without shame or weakness, it unlocked something in her that had been frozen for years. She wept openly, her shoulders shaking, and around her other women began to do the same. The soldiers continued. They sang "Wade in the Water," a spiritual that had served as a coded message for escaped slaves to evade tracking dogs by traveling through streams, now transformed into a universal metaphor for finding safety, for crossing over from danger to deliverance. They sang "Go Down Moses," with its powerful refrain of "Let my people go," a song that had sustained resistance and hope through generations of bondage. Each spiritual carried layers of meaning, historical depth, and emotional truth that required no translation. Margaret Hoffman would later write in her diary, "I understood no English. I knew none of these songs, but I understood everything. The voices told me stories of suffering that made our current misery seem small. They told me of a people who had survived what should have destroyed them. And they told me that the men singing these songs were not our enemies in the way we had been taught. They were human beings who had known pain and had transformed it into something beautiful rather than something destructive. I cried for the first time since before the conflict began. I cried for everything we had lost, everything we had done, everything we had believed that was false." The concert, if it could be called that, lasted nearly an hour. The soldiers sang spiritual after spiritual, the harmonies complex and moving, the emotional content profound. They sang "Deep River," with its longing for peace and rest. They sang "Nobody Knows the Trouble I've Seen," an anthem of hidden suffering and private grief. They sang "Steal Away to Jesus," another song that had served as a coded message during slavery, now expressing universal themes of seeking refuge and finding sanctuary. As they sang, more and more women emerged from the barracks. Those who had already gone inside came back out, drawn by the music. They gathered in clusters, sitting on the ground, on benches, on the steps of buildings. Some wept openly. Others sat in stunned silence, their faces reflecting confusion, grief, recognition, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. The guards at the perimeter, white American soldiers from other units, also stood transfixed. This was not entertainment. This was testimony. This was a people bearing witness to their own history, and in doing so, offering something to those who listened. Proof that humanity could survive even systematic attempts to destroy it. When the singing finally ended, Captain Morrison did not make a speech or offer explanation. He simply nodded to his men, and they dispersed quietly to their own quarters. The message had been delivered. Now it needed time to work its way into hearts and minds that had been closed by propaganda and fear. That night the compound was different. There was still tension, still uncertainty, but something had shifted. In the barracks, women who had barely spoken to each other began to talk. Margaret Hoffman found herself in conversation with 3 other women, discussing what they had heard, trying to understand the emotions it had stirred. "I did not expect this," said one woman, a former clerk named Greta Muller. "I did not expect to hear music like that from them. I did not expect to feel what I felt." "What did you feel?" asked Margaret. Greta was quiet for a long moment. "I felt seen. I felt like those men who we were taught were inferior, understood something about suffering that we are only now beginning to comprehend. I felt ashamed of what I believed, and I felt hope, which is strange, because we are prisoners with no certain future." Elizabeth Kaufman, lying in her bunk, stared at the ceiling and thought about the wounded men she had treated over the years. She had maintained a professional distance, a necessary protection for a nurse in wartime. But that music had stripped away all professional distance, all protective barriers. Those voices had reminded her that everyone involved in this conflict, on all sides, was a human being, with hopes and fears, with families and dreams, with the capacity for both suffering and transcendence. Young Anna Schmidt, in her bunk, felt her entire worldview crumbling. Everything she had been taught about racial hierarchy, about superiority and inferiority, about who was civilized and who was not, had been contradicted by those voices. The sophistication of the harmonies, the emotional depth of the expression, the clear evidence of a rich cultural tradition, all of it stood in stark opposition to the propaganda that had shaped her adolescence. She felt lost, confused, but also strangely freed. If that had been a lie, what else had been false? The singing became a regular occurrence. Every few evenings, the soldiers would gather and perform spirituals for about an hour. They never announced it or made it formal. They simply assembled and sang, and the women would emerge from their barracks to listen. Over time, the gatherings became more organized. Women would bring blankets to sit on. They would position themselves closer to the singers. The barrier of fear continued to erode. Captain Morrison carefully observed these changes. He saw women beginning to make eye contact with guards instead of looking away. He saw small gestures of acknowledgement, tentative at first, then gradually more confident. He also noticed something else. Some of the women began to hum along with familiar melodies, even though they didn't know the words. Music was creating a bridge across the chasm of language, nationality, and ideology. On the third week of May, Morrison decided to take a risk. After one of the evening singing sessions, he approached a group of women who had been particularly attentive listeners. With him was Private Jefferson, who spoke some German, having studied it at university before the conflict. Morrison spoke slowly, letting Jefferson translate. "I wanted you to know," he said, "that we're not singing for you. We're singing for ourselves. These songs have carried us through hard times. They're part of who we are, but if hearing them helps you in some way, we're glad." Margaret Hoffman, who had emerged as an informal spokesperson for the group, responded in halting English supplemented by Jefferson's translation. "The songs," she said carefully, "they speak of great suffering. We did not know. We were taught you had no culture, no depth. The songs prove this was a lie. We are grateful, and we are ashamed." Morrison nodded slowly. Everyone's been taught lies in this conflict. Everyone's been manipulated. The question is what we do now, knowing the truth. The question is how we rebuild humanity after everything that's tried to destroy it. This conversation, brief and somewhat awkward given the language barriers, marked a turning point. From that evening forward, there was visible relaxation in the compound. Women began to ask questions through interpreters. They wanted to know about the spirituals, their history, their meaning. American soldiers, initially cautious, began to engage in these conversations. Private Jefferson, with his education and language skills, became a crucial intermediary, explaining the history of slavery, the role of spirituals in sustaining resistance and hope, the ways that music had served as both comfort and coded communication. The women listened with growing understanding. They began to make connections between the African American experience and their own current situation. The loss of home, the uncertainty of the future, the challenge of maintaining identity and dignity in circumstances designed to strip both away. These parallels were not exact, of course. The women's current detention was temporary and relatively comfortable, nothing like the centuries of slavery that had produced the spirituals. But the emotional resonance was real. the recognition of shared human experiences of displacement and uncertainty. Frieda Weber, the schoolteacher, began organizing informal education sessions in the barracks. With Jefferson's help translating, she would explain to other women what she was learning about the African American experience. She approached this with the systematic thoroughness of her teaching background, taking notes, asking clarifying questions, and then presenting the information to groups of women who were hungry for understanding. "We were taught to believe in hierarchies," she told a gathering of about 30 women in one of the larger barracks. "We were taught that some people were inherently superior and others inherently inferior. The music we have heard proves this is false. You cannot create something so beautiful, so sophisticated, so emotionally profound without being fully human, without having a rich cultural tradition. If we were wrong about this, we were wrong about many things." These informal discussions became more frequent. Women who had been true believers in the ideology they had served began to question everything they had accepted as truth. This was a painful process, requiring the dismantling of worldviews that had given meaning and structure to their lives. But the evidence was overwhelming. The kindness of their captors, the beauty of the music, the obvious humanity of men they had been taught to regard as inferior, all of it demanded a fundamental reassessment. Not everyone went through this transformation. Some women remained resistant, clinging to familiar beliefs even as evidence mounted against them. There were tensions in the barracks between those who were opening themselves to new understanding and those who saw such openness as a betrayal. But the majority, particularly the younger women, began to change. Elizabeth Kaufman began attending the singing sessions with a small notebook, not to take notes on the music, but to sketch. She was a talented amateur artist, and she began drawing the faces of the soldiers as they sang. Her sketches captured something essential: the concentration, the emotion, the sense of collective purpose. When some of the soldiers saw these sketches, they were moved. Here was visual evidence of how they were being seen, not as guards or enemies, but as individuals engaged in something profound. One evening in early June, as the soldiers prepared to sing, Sergeant Wilson approached Captain Morrison with an unusual request. "Sir, some of the women have been asking, through Jefferson, if they could sing something for us. A German folk song or something. They're nervous about it, but they want to offer something in return." Morrison considered this carefully. It was a delicate situation. Allowing the women to perform could be seen as inappropriate fraternization, or it could be seen as a natural step in building human connections. He decided to allow it, with the understanding that it would be closely monitored. After the soldiers completed their evening of spirituals, Morrison announced through Jefferson that the women were welcome to share their own music if they wished. There was a long, uncertain pause. Then Margaret Hoffman stood up. Her voice was shaky as she spoke in German, Jefferson translating. "We would like to sing a song from our childhood," she said, "a folk song that speaks of home and longing for home. We do not sing it to glorify anything or to express politics. We sing it because, like your spirituals, it speaks of the heart's deepest feelings." She began to sing Der Mond ist aufgegangen, a beloved German evening hymn and folk song. Her voice was thin at first, uncertain, but then other women joined in. Unlike the rich harmonies of the spirituals, this was a simpler, more straightforward melody. But it was sung with genuine feeling, with longing and sadness and a tentative hope. The American soldiers listened respectfully. They did not understand the words, but they understood the emotion. Captain Morrison found himself thinking about his own home in Atlanta, about the church where he had led choirs, about the life he hoped to return to when this was all finally over. The universality of longing for home, for peace, for an end to displacement and uncertainty, transcended all the differences between these people. When the song ended, there was a moment of profound silence, then spontaneous applause from the American soldiers. The women looked surprised, then pleased, then some began to cry again. Margaret sat down, overwhelmed, and Elizabeth Kaufman put an arm around her shoulders. From that evening forward, the musical exchanges became more regular. The soldiers would sing spirituals, and then the women would sing German folk songs, hymns and lullabies. Never military songs or anything connected to ideology, just the music that spoke of human experiences: love, loss, home, hope, nature, and the passage of seasons. These exchanges created a space where everyone involved could be simply human, not defined by nationality or military status, but by shared emotional experiences. Private Jefferson, who participated in both the singing and the translation duties, found himself in a unique position to observe the transformation taking place. He would later write to his professor at Howard University, "What I am witnessing here is the power of culture to overcome propaganda. These women were taught to hate and fear us. But culture, real culture that speaks truth about the human experience, cannot be denied or ignored. The spirituals are doing what no amount of political re-education could do. They are proving our humanity in a way that cannot be argued against, and in doing so, they are freeing these women to rediscover their own humanity as well." The broader context of this remarkable situation became clearer as more news filtered into the compound about the end of the conflict. Germany had surrendered unconditionally on May 8th, though the administrative chaos of processing millions of prisoners and displaced persons meant that the women's facility continued to operate much as it had. The full horror of the concentration camps was becoming known, photographed, documented, and publicized. When this information reached the women in the compound, it created a new crisis. Many of the women had known nothing about the camps. Others had heard rumors but dismissed them as propaganda. A few had known more but compartmentalized it, telling themselves it was necessary or exaggerated or none of their concern. Now, confronted with photographic evidence and testimony, they had to process the reality that the regime they had served had committed atrocities beyond imagination. This was almost too much to bear. Several women became deeply depressed. 2 attempted self-harm and had to be placed under medical observation. The existential crisis of discovering that everything you had believed and served was not just wrong, but monstrous created psychological trauma that would take years to fully process. Captain Morrison recognized that this was a critical moment. The women needed to understand what had happened, but they also needed to not be destroyed by it. He consulted with the American chaplain, a white officer named Father Patrick O'Connor, who had been serving with various units in the European theater. O'Connor was a thoughtful man from Boston, a Catholic priest who had seen terrible things during the campaign and struggled with his own faith in the face of such suffering. He and Morrison had developed a mutual respect despite the segregated nature of the military. Now they worked together to help the women process this new and terrible knowledge. The approach they settled on was pastoral rather than punitive. There would be no lectures or condemnations. Instead, there would be space for grief, for horror, for processing. The singing sessions continued, but now they took on additional weight. The spirituals, songs born from one of history's great crimes against humanity, became a kind of testimony that evil could be resisted, that humanity could survive even systematic attempts to destroy it, that there was a path forward even from the deepest darkness. One evening Morrison chose to sing "We Shall Overcome," a spiritual that was already gaining significance as an anthem of resistance and hope. We shall overcome, we shall overcome, we shall overcome someday, see. The soldiers sang, and the words took on new layers of meaning in this context. It was a promise that the human spirit could outlast any oppression, any ideology, any attempt at dehumanization. Margaret Hoffman, listening to this, understood something profound. The men singing these songs were descendants of people who had survived centuries of oppression. They had maintained their humanity, their culture, their dignity, despite everything designed to strip it away. If they could do that, if they could not only survive but create beauty and meaning from their suffering, then perhaps there was hope even for those who had, however unknowingly or directly, participated in evil. She stood up, something she had not planned to do, and through Jefferson's translation asked permission to speak. Morrison nodded. "We did not know," she said, her voice breaking. "Some did not know, others did not want to know. We believed lies and served evil. The music you share with us, it comes from people who survived evil and remained human. We do not deserve this gift you are giving us, but we need it. We need to learn how to be human again." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, with Jefferson translating. None of us gets to choose the circumstances we're born into. You were born into a society that fed you lies from childhood. My people were born into a society that denied our humanity from birth. The question is never really about deserving. The question is about what we do now, knowing what we know. You can let this knowledge destroy you, or you can let it transform you. The spirituals teach us that transformation is possible, that you can come through fire and be refined rather than destroyed. This conversation became legendary within the compound. Women who had not been present heard about it secondhand, and its essence spread through all the barracks. It offered a framework for processing guilt and horror, acknowledgement without self-destruction, responsibility without paralysis, and the possibility of transformation. As June progressed, the administrative situation of the compound evolved. Transport was being arranged to move the women to proper processing centers where their individual situations would be evaluated. Some would be released to return to destroyed homes and uncertain futures. Others would face more serious scrutiny based on their specific roles during the conflict. All would leave the compound within the next few weeks. Recognizing that their time together was limited, both the soldiers and the women intensified their interactions. The musical sessions became longer and more frequent. Women taught soldiers German folk songs, and soldiers taught women spirituals. Everyone stumbling over unfamiliar words and melodies, but trying earnestly. These teaching sessions were often punctuated with laughter, a sound that had been rare in the compound's early days, but now rang out regularly. Frieda Weber, the schoolteacher, organized a formal project. With Morrison's permission and Jefferson's help, she began documenting the spirituals they had learned. She wrote out the melodies as best she could, noted the English lyrics phonetically, and included Jefferson's explanations of their historical and cultural context. She worked on this project with the dedication she had once brought to lesson planning, creating a document that would preserve what had happened here. This must not be forgotten, she explained to a group of women helping with the project. What happened here, the transformation that occurred, it is too important to lose. When we leave this place, we will return to a Germany that is destroyed, that must be rebuilt not just physically, but morally. We must carry this knowledge with us, that humanity is universal, that culture has the power to overcome propaganda, that there is always a path forward, even from the deepest darkness. Elizabeth Kaufman contributed her sketches to this project. She had dozens now, capturing moments from the musical sessions, portraits of individual soldiers, scenes of daily life in the compound, that showed the gradual breaking down of barriers. Together with Frieda's written documentation, these sketches created a remarkable record of a unique moment in post-conflict history. Young Anna Schmidt, who at 19 was finding her entire worldview rebuilt from the ground up, wrote a series of reflective essays about her experience. Writing in a notebook provided by the American Supplies, she documented her journey from true believer to someone questioning everything she had been taught. Her essays were raw and honest, filled with shame and confusion, but also with hope and determination. I was taught to hate people I did not know, she wrote. I was taught to believe in superiority that did not exist. I was taught to serve a cause that was evil. All of this happened before I was old enough to think critically, and so I accepted it as truth. The first step in becoming truly human is recognizing that you were deceived. The second step is choosing to be different. The music of the African American soldiers has shown me what is possible. They came from suffering I cannot imagine, yet they created beauty. They had every reason to hate, yet they showed kindness. They were told they were inferior, yet they demonstrated profound humanity. If they could do this, then I can choose to become someone different than who I was raised to be. As the final days of the compound's operation approached, there was a sense of urgency to make the most of the remaining time. The soldiers put together a special concert, performing not just spirituals, but also some of the German songs they had learned, creating a genuinely cross-cultural program. The women in turn organized a small presentation, reading some of their written reflections in German with Jefferson translating. The evening before the first transport was scheduled to leave, carrying about 100 women to a processing center in Frankfurt, Captain Morrison called everyone together for a final gathering. It was a warm June evening, and the sun was setting over the Bavarian hills in brilliant colors. All 347 women were present, along with the 40 soldiers who had formed the core of the singing group. Other American personnel, having heard about what had been happening, also gathered to observe. Morrison spoke with Jefferson translating sentence by sentence. When we first arrived here and took responsibility for this facility, we had a job to do. Guard prisoners, maintain security, ensure everyone was fed and safe. That was our duty, and we fulfilled it. But something else happened here, something none of us planned or expected. We became human beings to each other, not just guards and prisoners, not just victors and defeated, but people sharing space and time and ultimately sharing our humanity. He paused, looking around at the assembled crowd. The spirituals we sang were not entertainment. They were testimony. They were proof that culture and humanity can survive even systematic attempts to destroy them, that people can come through centuries of oppression and not just survive, but create beauty, meaning, and moral strength. I think you heard that testimony. I think it reached you, and I hope you will carry it forward into whatever comes next. Margaret Hoffman responded, standing and speaking clearly in German, with Jefferson translating. When we arrived here, we were afraid. We had been taught that you would be cruel, that you were inferior, that you were dangerous. Everything we were taught was a lie. The music you shared proved that. The kindness you showed proved that. We came here as prisoners of war. We leave as human beings who have learned what humanity truly means. We cannot undo what was done. We cannot erase our participation, however indirect, in evil. But we can carry forward the lessons we learned here. We can testify, as you testified through your songs, that transformation is possible and that humanity can be rebuilt even from complete moral destruction. Then something extraordinary happened. Without planning or coordination, both the soldiers and the women began to sing together. They sang Deep River, one of the spirituals that both groups now knew. The harmonies were imperfect. The pronunciation was sometimes awkward, but the emotional truth was undeniable. 387 voices, American and German, black and white, singing together about crossing over to peace, about finding a campground, about the longing for home and rest and the end of conflict. When the song ended, there was not a dry eye in the compound. Soldiers and former prisoners embraced. Guards and detainees who had maintained careful professional distance now acknowledged their shared humanity. It was a moment of genuine reconciliation, small in scale, but profound in meaning. Over the following 3 weeks, the compound gradually emptied as women were transported to processing centers. Each departure was emotional. Women who had arrived as strangers, united only by their service to a defeated regime, now left as individuals who had experienced a transformation. They exchanged addresses, promised to stay in touch, and committed to sharing what they had learned. Many of them would keep these promises. In the decades that followed, several of the women would become active in reconciliation efforts. Margaret Hoffman became a teacher in Munich, incorporating lessons about propaganda, critical thinking, and cultural respect into her curriculum. She kept her diary from the compound and in the 1960s published excerpts in a German educational journal documenting the transformation she and others had experienced. Frieda Weber returned to a destroyed Dresden and dedicated herself to rebuilding education with an emphasis on democratic values and cross-cultural understanding. She used the materials she had created during her detention, the documentation of the spirituals and their meaning, as teaching tools. She corresponded with Private Jefferson for nearly 40 years, maintaining a friendship that began in a prisoner of war compound. Elizabeth Kaufman became a psychiatric nurse working with trauma survivors, including many Germans dealing with the psychological aftermath of the conflict and its revelations. She used her experience in the compound as a framework for understanding how people could be complicit in evil through indoctrination and how they could begin the process of moral recovery. Her sketches from the compound were eventually donated to a museum of post-conflict reconciliation. Young Anna Schmidt pursued higher education, something that would have been unusual for a woman of her generation under the previous regime. She studied history and education, eventually earning a doctorate and becoming a professor specializing in the role of propaganda in authoritarian systems. She used her own experience as a case study, documenting how she had been indoctrinated as a child and adolescent, and how encountering authentic culture and humanity had begun to break down that indoctrination. She published several influential books on education reform and critical thinking. The American soldiers also carried the experience forward. Captain Morrison returned to Atlanta and resumed his work as a music teacher and choir director, but now with a deeper understanding of the power of cultural expression. He taught his students not just how to sing spirituals, but why they mattered, how they had served as resistance and hope, and how they could still speak truth to power. He corresponded with several of the German women for years, maintaining connections that seemed impossible given their initial circumstances. Sergeant Wilson went back to Birmingham and became involved in the civil rights movement that was beginning to gather strength. His experience in Germany had shown him that change was possible, that deeply held beliefs could be transformed through authentic encounter with truth and humanity. He brought this conviction to his activism, insisting on the power of cultural expression and nonviolent testimony. Private Jefferson completed his education at Howard University and became a historian, specializing in African American cultural history and the role of spirituals in sustaining resistance and identity. He wrote extensively about his experience in the German prisoner compound, analyzing it as an example of cultural diplomacy at its most fundamental level. His work influenced thinking about post-conflict reconciliation and the role of cultural exchange in breaking down enmity. The compound itself was dismantled in July 1945, converted back to temporary housing for displaced persons of various nationalities. The buildings that had hosted this remarkable encounter between cultures, between victors and defeated, between people taught to hate who learned to recognize shared humanity, became just another piece of infrastructure in the massive reconstruction effort. But the memory persisted. Several of the participants wrote about their experiences. Photographs that had been taken, officially and unofficially, survived. The documentation that Frieda Weber had created circulated in educational circles. The story became known, initially in small circles, then more widely, as participants shared their accounts. In 1968, when Margaret Hoffmann published her diary excerpts, they caused a small sensation in Germany. This was a period of intense reckoning with the past, a time when the generation that had lived through the conflict was being challenged by their children to account for their actions and beliefs. Margaret's honest documentation of her transformation provided a model for how to acknowledge complicity while also testifying to the possibility of change. She wrote in the introduction to the published excerpts, "We are often asked how it was possible that ordinary people participated in or enabled evil. The answer is through indoctrination, through propaganda, through the systematic dehumanization of others. But we must also ask, how is it possible to break free from such indoctrination? My answer, based on experience, is through authentic encounter with the humanity of those we have been taught to despise. The African American soldiers who guarded us could have been cruel. They would have been justified in seeking revenge. Instead, they shared with us the most profound gift, their culture, their music, their testimony of survival and transformation. They showed us what we could become if we chose humanity over ideology." This testimony resonated with many Germans struggling with questions of guilt, responsibility, and the possibility of moral recovery. It offered a framework that was neither self-exonerating nor self-destructive. Acknowledge what happened, understand how it happened, learn from those who have survived their own oppression, and commit to different choices going forward. The spirituals themselves, the actual musical tradition that had catalyzed this transformation, continued their own journey through history. In the decades following the conflict, they became recognized internationally as both artistic achievements and historical documents. The same songs that Captain Morrison and his men had sung in a Bavarian prisoner compound were sung in churches, concert halls, and protest movements around the world. They became anthems of the American civil rights movement, proving again their power to testify to suffering and to insist on dignity and justice. Some of the German women who had heard these songs in the compound sought them out again in later years. Frida Weber made a special trip to the United States in 1973, visiting African American churches in the South to hear spirituals sung in their original context. She was invited to share her story at several churches, and her testimony about how these songs had transformed her understanding created powerful moments of connection across decades and cultures. She spoke at one church in Birmingham, Alabama, Sergeant Wilson's home church, and he was in the audience. They had corresponded for years but had never met again after 1945. Now, nearly 30 years later, they embraced as old friends. She told the congregation, "These songs saved my life and my soul. I was lost in ideology and propaganda. I had participated, however indirectly, in great evil. The spirituals showed me that transformation is possible, that humanity can survive and flourish even after terrible suffering. They showed me what I needed to become. I will always be grateful," Wilson responded simply. "We sang what was in our hearts. We sang our history and our hope. If it reached you, if it helped you find your way back to your own humanity, then the songs did what they were meant to do. They testified, they witnessed, they told the truth about suffering and survival. That's all we were trying to do, and I'm grateful it was heard." This exchange, captured on film by a local television station, became a minor documentary sensation. It illustrated something that seemed almost impossible: genuine reconciliation between people from opposite sides of history's most destructive conflict, facilitated by cultural expression that transcended language, nationality, and ideology. The academic community eventually took notice of this story. Historians studying post-conflict reconciliation found in it a case study of unusual power. Unlike most instances of reconciliation, which occurred through formal diplomatic processes or political initiatives, this had been organic, cultural, and profoundly personal. It suggested that cultural exchange might be as important as political agreements in truly transforming relationships between former enemies. Anthropologists and ethnomusicologists analyzed how music had functioned in this context. They noted that the spirituals carried multiple levels of meaning, as beautiful compositions, as historical documents, as testimony of survival, and as proof of the cultural sophistication that propaganda had denied. The songs had created a space for emotional expression and connection that words alone could not have achieved, especially given language barriers and the weight of recent history. Educational theorists studied Anna Schmidt's documented transformation as a model for understanding how to counter indoctrination. Her detailed account of how encountering authentic culture had begun to break down her ideological conditioning provided insights relevant to education in democratic societies. The key elements were identified as authentic encounter with those who had been dehumanized by propaganda, cultural expressions that could not be easily dismissed or ignored, time and space to process new understanding, and supportive community to reinforce new insights. Psychologists examined the process by which the women had moved from fear to understanding to transformation. They identified several crucial factors: the non-threatening context of the detention that contradicted expectations of violence, the regular exposure to cultural expressions that spoke profound truths, the opportunity to engage in reciprocal cultural exchange, and the presence of interpreters and facilitators who could help process the experience. This became a model for understanding how prejudice and indoctrination could be challenged at the psychological level. Perhaps most significantly, the story became incorporated into Holocaust education programs. It was used to illustrate how ordinary people could be indoctrinated, how propaganda worked to dehumanize others, and how encountering authentic humanity could begin to break down that dehumanization. But it also served another purpose. It demonstrated that even those who had been complicit in evil could transform, that moral recovery was possible, and that the path forward required both acknowledgement and learning from those who had survived oppression. This was a delicate balance. The story could not be used to minimize guilt or to suggest that transformation was easy or automatic. The women in the compound had been relatively minor participants in the German apparatus, auxiliaries rather than direct perpetrators. Their transformation did not erase their complicity, and educators were careful to maintain this distinction. But within those parameters, the story offered something valuable, evidence that change was possible and that authentic cross-cultural encounter could facilitate that change. By the late 20th century, several of the key participants had passed away, but they had left extensive documentation. Diaries, letters, photographs, sketches, written reflections, and recorded oral histories had been preserved. In 2003, a documentary film was produced that brought together all available materials, including interviews with surviving participants and their descendants. The film, titled Spirituals of Freedom, told the story comprehensively and became an educational staple in schools, universities, and reconciliation programs around the world. The documentary included a particularly moving segment featuring correspondence between Frida Weber and Private Jefferson spanning 40 years. Their letters documented not just their continuing friendship, but their ongoing dialogue about culture, education, reconciliation, and the possibility of learning from history. Jefferson had shared with Weber his experiences in the American Civil Rights Movement, and she had shared with him her work rebuilding German education. They had served as witnesses for each other, testifying to the power of transformation and the importance of cultural exchange. In one letter from 1978, Jefferson wrote to Weber, "I've been thinking about those days in Bavaria, more than 30 years ago now. At the time, we were just trying to get through our service, to fulfill our duty, and to maintain our own humanity in circumstances that often tried to strip it away. We sang because singing was what we did, how we sustained ourselves. We never imagined it would have such an impact. But I think now that what happened was not really about us or about you as individuals. It was about the power of authentic culture to speak truth that transcends individual circumstance. The spirituals were bigger than us. They carried centuries of suffering and survival, and that truth was powerful enough to break through decades of propaganda. This gives me hope as I continue the work here, fighting for justice and dignity. Culture is not frivolous or decorative. It is foundational. It testifies to who we are and what we can become." Weber responded in her characteristically thoughtful way. "Your letter moved me deeply, as your letters always do. You speak of the spirituals being bigger than individual circumstance, and I think this is profoundly true. But I also think the men who sang them mattered enormously. You sang with authenticity, with genuine feeling, without any attempt to manipulate or propagandize. That authenticity was itself a powerful teaching. We had been fed lies wrapped in emotional manipulation for years. To hear truth expressed with genuine emotion, not fabricated sentiment, was shocking in the best possible way. It demanded recognition. So yes, the spirituals carried centuries of meaning, but you and your fellow soldiers carried them with integrity, and that combination was what reached us. I try to bring that same authenticity to my teaching now. Facts matter, but they must be conveyed with genuine care for truth and for students' development. This is what I learned from you all those years ago." This exchange, preserved and published in the documentary's companion materials, captured the essence of what had happened in that Bavarian compound in 1945. It was about more than music, more than cultural exchange, more than post-conflict reconciliation. It was about the power of authentic humanity to overcome dehumanization, the capacity of culture to carry and communicate profound truths, and the possibility of transformation even after great evil. The women who had heard the spirituals in that compound carried the experience with them for the rest of their lives. They taught their children and grandchildren about it. They used it as a touchstone for understanding how they had been deceived and how they had begun the process of recovery. The American soldiers who had sung carried it as well, as a reminder that their culture had power beyond what they might have imagined, that the traditions passed down through generations of suffering and survival could reach across the deepest divides. In the decades that followed, as Germany rebuilt and transformed into a democratic society committed to confronting its past, the story of the compound served a particular purpose. It was an example of how transformation happened, not through denunciation or punishment alone, but through encounter with authentic humanity and culture. It demonstrated that people who had been complicit in or supportive of evil could change, but that this change required more than political re-education. It required an encounter with truth so profound that it could not be denied or dismissed. The spirituals themselves, far removed now from their origins in slavery, but still carrying that history within them, continued to be performed, studied, and cherished. They remained testimony to one of humanity's great crimes and to the resilience of people who survived and transcended that crime. And now they also carried an additional layer of meaning, as instruments of reconciliation, as bridges across the deepest chasms of ideology and enmity, as proof that culture has the power to transform when politics alone cannot. In 2015, 70 years after the events in the compound, a commemoration was held in Germany. Descendants of both the German women and the American soldiers gathered at a location near where the compound had been. The actual buildings were long gone, replaced by a small park, but a memorial plaque had been installed explaining what had happened there. The ceremony included performances of spirituals by an African-American choir from Atlanta, Captain Morrison's hometown, and German folk songs by a local choir. The event was small, not a major diplomatic occasion, but for those present, it carried immense emotional weight. Margaret Hoffman's granddaughter spoke, reading from her grandmother's diary. Elizabeth Kaufman's great-niece displayed some of the original sketches in a small exhibition. Anna Schmidt's daughter, now herself a retired professor, spoke about her mother's journey from indoctrinated youth to thoughtful educator, a transformation that began in this place. From the American side, Sergeant Wilson's son sang "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot," in a powerful bass that his father would have appreciated. Private Jefferson's grandson, himself a professor of history, spoke about how his grandfather had understood the power of cultural testimony. The event concluded with everyone singing "Deep River" together, just as the American soldiers and German women had done 70 years earlier. The words carried across the park, across the decades, testimony to the enduring power of authentic culture to speak truths that transcend individual circumstance and historical moment. One of the speakers at the commemoration, a German historian who had studied the compound as part of broader research on post-conflict reconciliation, summarized the significance. What happened here in 1945 was small in scale, but profound in meaning. It demonstrated that culture is not simply entertainment or decoration. It is a carrier of values, of history, of truth. The African-American soldiers who sang spirituals here were not trying to convince anyone of anything. They were simply being themselves, expressing their heritage, but in doing so, they provided irrefutable evidence of their humanity and their cultural richness. The German women who heard them were confronted with a truth that contradicted everything they had been taught. Some were transformed by this encounter. They carried that transformation forward into post-conflict Germany, contributing to the moral rebuilding that was as necessary as the physical rebuilding. This is a story of the power of culture, the possibility of transformation, and the importance of authentic human connection across the deepest divides. The story of what happened when German women prisoners of war heard African-American soldiers sing spirituals in a Bavarian compound in 1945 resonates because it speaks to universal human experiences. The capacity for indoctrination and the possibility of transformation, the power of propaganda and the greater power of authentic truth, the tendency to dehumanize others and the capacity to recognize shared humanity. The persistence of culture as a carrier of meaning across generations and across boundaries of nation, language, and ideology. It is a story about music, but also about much more than music. It is about how people communicate what matters most, how they sustain themselves through suffering, and how they build bridges across chasms that seem unbridgeable. It is about the specific history of African Americans and the specific history of Germans in the mid-20th century. But it is also about the universal human experiences of suffering, survival, guilt, redemption, fear, and hope. The spirituals that catalyzed this transformation were themselves products of one of history's great crimes, the enslavement of millions of people over centuries. Yet from that crime came a cultural tradition of extraordinary depth, beauty, and power. The songs testified to suffering, but also to the refusal to be destroyed by suffering. They acknowledged pain, but insisted on hope. They were born from oppression, but contained within them the seeds of liberation. When these songs were sung in a prisoner compound in defeated Germany, they carried all of this history and meaning with them. The German women who heard them were themselves products of indoctrination, participants in a system that had committed atrocities, but they were also human beings capable of recognizing truth when they encountered it. The songs reached them because authentic truth, authentically expressed, has a power that propaganda cannot match. The transformation that occurred was not instantaneous or complete. It was the beginning of a process that would take years to fully unfold. But it was real, documented in diaries, letters, sketches, and the testimonies of those involved. Women who arrived at the compound believing one set of things left believing something quite different. They had encountered evidence they could not dismiss, that the people they had been taught to despise were fully human, culturally rich, and morally sophisticated. This encounter did not erase their guilt or their complicity, but it opened the possibility of transformation, of moral recovery, of becoming something different than what they had been. The American soldiers who sang were simply expressing their heritage, maintaining their identity in difficult circumstances, doing what their communities had always done to sustain themselves. They could not have fully understood the impact they were having. They were fulfilling their duties as guards, maintaining order and security, and singing in their spare time because singing was part of who they were. But in being authentically themselves, in expressing their culture without apology or compromise, they provided something that formal re-education programs could never have provided, living proof that everything the propaganda had said was a lie. This is the deepest lesson of what happened in that Bavarian compound in the spring and early summer of 1945. Transformation requires encounter with authentic truth. Reconciliation requires recognition of shared humanity. Culture has the power to communicate what political systems cannot, and people, even people who have been complicit in terrible things, can change when confronted with truths too powerful to deny. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.